Welcome back, everyone, to today's explainer. Now, for this one, I want you to put yourselves in a very specific set of shoes. Imagine we are sitting right there in the Oval Office, acting as White House advisors during the administration of our 8th president, Martin Van Buren. Looking from the inside out, we're going to take a completely objective, chronological look at his rise to power, his highly controversial choices during some truly unprecedented national crises, and ultimately, his sudden political free fall. Every single detail we're exploring today comes straight from the historical record. So let's set the stage. As an advisor reflecting on the Van Buren years, this right here is the million-dollar question you'd be trying to figure out. You see, Van Buren practically invented the modern political machine. The guy was an absolute master tactician. They literally called him the little magician. And yet, as we'll see, the very machine he helped build, it eventually turned around and completely dismantled his career. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The Little Magician's Rise. Before the epic fall, there was the brilliant, meticulous climb to the top. Let's look at where he actually came from. Notice the stark contrast. It's absolutely fascinating. Martin Van Buren was actually the very first U.S.-born citizen to become president. His parents were Dutch, and his dad was just a modest tavern keeper up in Kinderhook, New York. Van Buren was a self-taught lawyer who learned the ropes of politics literally by listening to the patrons in his dad's tavern. Now contrast that humble start with William Henry Harrison, his future political rival. Harrison was born into a super wealthy Virginia family and had a very comfortable college education. Just file that reality away in your head because it's going to become a massive deal a little later on. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer chaos of this moment. This shows the wild mob at the White House during Andrew Jackson's 1828's inauguration. I mean, people were literally breaking furniture just to get to the drinks. Jackson represented this raw, totally unfiltered frontier populist energy. But Van Buren, he was Jackson's vice president, and he was the exact opposite. He was the quiet mastermind behind the Albany Regency, which was this incredibly strict, behind-the-scenes political machine in New York, built on discipline, loyalty, and patronage. Basically, Van Buren was the quiet manager behind Jackson's incredibly loud movement. Section 2. A cascade of crises. Stepping into the presidency in 1837, Van Buren swore he'd walk right in Jackson's footsteps. But as his advisors, we'd realize real quick that his rigid political philosophy was about to be put through the ringer. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what landed on the president's desk the second he took the oath. He's inaugurated in March of 1837. By May, the banks completely collapse. Skip to 1838, and he executes the massive forced removal of the Cherokee. And then in 1839, the International Amistad Mutiny sparks this fierce legal battle over slavery. It's just crisis after crisis. The sheer volume and the rapid-fire speed of these events left our administration constantly playing defense. Section 3. The Panic of 1837. Let's shift our focus to the absolute catastrophic economic collapse that defined almost his entire single term. So look at how the word panic itself totally evolved during this era. Before all this, a panic just meant a sudden, causeless fright. But during the bank wars, Americans basically weaponized the word. They started using panic to imply that politicians, specifically Jackson and Van Buren, caused the economic crash. What's super interesting is that the British were dealing with the exact same global economic downturn, but they called it a crisis, blaming systemic financial issues rather than one specific guy. But in America, that linguistic shift laid the blame squarely at the front door of the White House. And you have to understand, the human cost of this was incredibly severe and immediate. Take the tragic story of Theodore Nicollet from May 1837. He was a wildly successful, wealthy merchant down in New Orleans. But the paralyzing financial uncertainty, what people back then called the derangement of commercial affairs, it drove him to take his own life before the banks even officially suspended their payments. This was the intense, very real-world anxiety sweeping the nation that our administration was staring down. So, how did the boss respond to failing banks and totally bankrupt farmers? Well, Van Buren stubbornly stuck to his guns. He kept Jackson's cabinet and flat out refused to revive a national bank. Instead, he pitched an independent treasury system to entirely divorce government funds from private banks. Now, putting our advisor hats back on, you could see the political gridlock coming from a mile away. Both Whigs and Democrats initially fought it, and the legislation didn't even pass until 1840, which meant the economic bleeding just dragged on and on for almost his entire presidency. Section 4. Slavery and the Amistad. While the economy was literally in flames, deeply divisive moral issues were landing right on the president's desk. let's look objectively at his handling of slavery. Van Buren made his stance crystal clear to his pro-slavery base on day one. In his 1837 inaugural address, he flat out said he would resist and control every effort, foreign or domestic, which aims or would lead to overthrow our institutions. Doing the political math of the day, this was a very direct signal to Southern supporters. He was making an objective promise that the administration would fiercely protect the institution of slavery from any abolitionist pressure. But that promise was put to the ultimate test with the Amistad case. In 1839, kidnapped Africans mutinied on a Spanish slave ship off the coast of Cuba, and the ship was eventually seized by a U.S. brig off Long Island. Sticking to his pro-slavery promises, President Van Buren actually stepped in and issued an executive order to return the mutinous Africans right back to the Spanish enslavers. But abolitionists jumped in, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Former President John Quincy Adams defended the Africans, and the court officially declared them free. Van Buren's executive overreach was completely shut down. Section 5. Continuing Native American removal. That rigid adherence to the established party agenda extended to domestic expansion too, especially regarding Native American populations. Looking strictly at the facts and actions of the administration, Van Buren aggressively carried out Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, and the reality was incredibly grim. His War Department prosecuted the brutally expensive Second Seminole War in Florida. Then, in 1838, Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott to carry out the forced relocation of the Cherokee, what we now know as the Trail of Tears. Due to incompetent planning and brutal execution, the death toll was immense, with an estimated 4,000 Cherokee lives lost. Now, take those staggering, awful numbers and contrast them with the official White House narrative. In his December 1838 message to Congress, Van Buren officially reported that the removal had the happiest effects and was executed with commendable energy and humanity. As his political advisors, reading the historical documents, the massive disconnect between the devastating reality on the ground and the incredibly polished messaging in Washington is profoundly revealing. Section 6. The Gold Spoon Campaign. Let's move to 1840 and see how this all builds up. Those compounding economic crises, plus all the controversial executive actions, it handed the opposition absolute gold. Remember the real backgrounds of these two guys we talked about earlier? Well, this is where the Whig Party completely inverted reality. They launched this massive, absolutely unprecedented campaign painting William Henry Harrison, the super wealthy, college-educated Virginian, as this rough-and-tumble log cabin commoner who loved hard cider. And on the flip side, they painted Van Buren, the self-taught son of a tavern keeper, as this totally out-of-touch, wealthy aristocrat living in the lap of luxury while the whole country was suffering through a depression. And the attacks? They were deeply, viciously personal. In what became famous as the Gold Spoon speech, Representative Charles Ogle spent 3 whole days accusing Van Buren of blowing public money on wild luxuries. He literally claimed the president was supplying his toilet with double extract of Queen Victoria and foreign-cut wine coolers. The Whigs printed millions of copies of this speech. It was a brilliant, cutthroat maneuver that absolutely shredded Van Buren's image as a man of the people right in the middle of a financial panic. And the result was total electoral devastation. The little magician's mighty political machine was completely steamrolled by the Whigs' new tactics. Harrison trounced Van Buren 234-60 in the Electoral College. Van Buren was beaten so badly by the Tippecanoe and Tyler II ticket that he didn't even win his own home state of New York. Just like that, he was a one-term president. Section 7. Van Buren's Unlikely Legacy. But hey, the story does not end there. In fact, the final chapter of Van Buren's political life is probably the most shocking, because he completely upended the very platform he stood on while in the Oval Office. 8 years after getting crushed in the election, a splinter group of New York Democrats called the Barn Burners broke off to form the Free Soil Party. And guess who they nominated for president in 1848? Martin Van Buren. The core objective of this new party was unmistakable: free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. They built their entire platform on directly opposing the expansion of slavery into the new Western territories. Which leaves us with one seriously remarkable final question. How in the world does a politician who used his absolute executive power to protect slavery in 1840 become the vanguard nominee for an anti-slavery ticket just 8 years later? Was it a genuine, deep-down moral awakening? Or was it just one last desperate maneuver by the little magician? Stepping out of our advisor roles and looking back at history, it's a fascinating look at the shifting sands of political legacy. I really encourage you to dig into the history yourself and decide. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and stay focused.